Russian troops continue their assault operations in the Kupiansk direction. The enemy is trying to advance toward Kupiansk-Uzlovoy and push Ukrainian forces beyond the Oskol River. According to fighters from the 1st Presidential Brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard, Borove, attacks are being carried out in the Kupiansk direction. They are mostly carried out in bad weather, since fog and rain make aerial observation more difficult. The Russians move in small groups and try to slip between Ukrainian positions. However, most of the assault troops are destroyed and the wounded retreat back. Drone pilots from the 3rd Army Corps eliminated a Russian heavy flamethrower system, Solntsepyok, in the Lyman area. The footage of the combat operation shows the detonation of a rocket salvo. The 220mm TOS uses thermobaric munitions, which are capable of destroying fortifications and inflicting serious damage on personnel. To be continued. Meanwhile, in the Lyman direction, the Russian army attacked near the settlements of Frekivka, Novoyegorivka, Rydkadub, Karpivka, and toward Drobasheva. Near Konstantinovka, the invaders assaulted Ukrainian positions around Plashivka, Ivanopilya, and Rusiny Yar. On the Pokrovsk front, the hottest section of the front line, clashes took place near Vladimirovka, Fedorovka, Nekhonorovka, Kotlin, and Udachne.
Ukrainian forces are still managing to regain positions on the Pokrovsk front that they had previously lost. Work is underway to reclaim our positions. 170,000 Russian troops are taking part in the assault on the city of Pokrovsk, but out of all these, there are actually about 70,000 real assault troops. In addition, around 20,000 Marines have been attached to them. We don't know what condition they're in, whether they're the main force or if they've already been replaced and rotated 8 times and so on. The rest, the remaining number, are support units that, in one way or another, help the Russian army maintain its offensive potential. In
Pokrovsk itself, the Ukrainian armed forces continue search and assault operations and are clearing the urban area of Russian occupiers. Additional logistical routes are also being established toward Pokrovsk and Mirnohrad. According to the military, the Russian army is suffering significant losses both in manpower and equipment. Enemy assault groups, as well as locations where their personnel are concentrated, are regularly detected and eliminated. For example, Special Operations Forces units destroyed a gathering place of enemy personnel in one of the districts of Pokrovsk. Ukrainian drones struck a high-rise building where Russian troops had settled in for regrouping and an attempted advance. At the same time, the situation in the Huliai Pole direction is difficult, but there is no encirclement of Ukrainian defenders. Logistics are in place and the evacuation of the wounded is underway, according to Ukraine's defense forces. The armed forces of Ukraine are holding the line, destroying 250 to 300 invaders and more than 50 pieces of various equipment every day.
The Russian Federation wants to capture Huliai Pole, which is considered one of the defensive lines of the Ukrainian army, but again, I know that Ukrainian assault troops are currently working to stabilize the situation. The Russian Federation took advantage of the fog. The fog was very thick in this region. They took advantage of it, and at that particular moment outplayed the Ukrainian forces, we have to admit. But right now, efforts are underway to stabilize the situation and to prevent the Russian army from advancing further. It's a tough job because there aren't enough forces. The Russian army really does have a lot of troops, a lot of strength. And
in the Siversk direction, the enemy attempted to strike the defense forces by setting up an ambush with FPV drones on one of the supply routes. However, the operators of the Onyx strike drone company detected the ambush and the enemy's strike positions in time. As a result of precise strikes by bombers, the Russian drones were destroyed.
And now, more details about the events on the front line. Since the start of the full-scale invasion, Russian army losses have already exceeded 1,169,000 soldiers. These figures were announced by the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine. Just in the past day, the defense forces eliminated 1,140 Russian occupiers. They also destroyed 1 tank, 3 armored vehicles, 21 artillery systems, 1 multiple rocket launcher, 1 air defense system, as well as 110 units of enemy automotive and special equipment.
Overall, the General Staff of the Armed Forces of Ukraine recorded 216 combat engagements on the front line in the past day. The Russian army has intensified assaults in several directions. In particular, on the Slavyansk front, the enemy tried to attack the defense forces' positions 7 times. On the southern Slobozhansky front, 11 times. On the Oleksandrovka front, 14 times. On the Huliai Pole front, Ukrainian defenders repelled 17 enemy attacks and 31 on the Konstantinivka front. Two hotspots have emerged on the front: the Lyman direction, where Russian occupiers stormed Ukrainian positions 43 times, and the Pokrovsk direction, where the Russians tried to break through Ukrainian defenses 49 times.
And for more details about what is happening on the front, we will talk with our guest. The spokesperson for the Ukrainian Volunteer Army, Serhiy Bratchik, is joining us live on Freedom. Serhiy, good morning, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes and defense forces. Greetings.
Welcome.
Well, indeed, while certain processes are underway regarding, let's call it, the peace plan. Yes, that's what many in the media are calling it, at least. It's clear that the most compelling arguments are still being made by the armed forces of Ukraine on the battlefield. Speaking of the situation at the front, what is it like today?
Well, judging by the locations you've listed and the number of combat engagements, it's obvious that the front is in a very intense phase right now. Fierce fighting continues along the entire line of contact. You can see that today the Russians have become more active in all directions, including those that were previously, at least in the media, less well known than the Pokrovsk and Mirangrad directions. Today it's clear that the enemy is acting very aggressively in Huliai Pole. The enemy is conducting very active combat operations in the Konstantinovka direction, as well as in the Oleksandrovsk, Southern Sloboshansk, Siversk, and Lyman directions. In other words, practically all the hotspots along the line of contact cover every front direction. It's obvious that today the Russians are trying to accomplish the task that, according to their calculations and deadlines, they were supposed to complete back in mid-August or at the latest in September. In other words, as we discussed in your studio, the Russians will try to enter all major cities of Ukraine from all the directions we've mentioned and essentially start urban combat there. That is, to enter this phase during the fall-winter period and at the very least continue these urban battles until the spring of next year with quite possible positive outcomes for the Russians. In other words, this is about advancing in urban areas and essentially carrying out the tasks of occupying the settlements that we are now talking about. Obviously, this is also being widely covered by Russian media right now. They're once again spreading fake news. You know, there's information that the Russians are spreading, claims that they're supposedly in the center of Konstantinovka. They're also claiming that they've practically entered Siversk, even though in reality they're just trying to infiltrate the outskirts of the city and accordingly are attempting to reach Lyman. And well, this is happening at all the current hotspots on the map of active combat. In other words, the main objective for the Russians today is to get into the cities and engage in urban warfare there.
Serhiy, tell me, if we correlate the current situation with what we're seeing now in the international arena, in the context of all these negotiations and so on, what does that look like? Serhiy, but you know, there's something else I'd like to ask you about. And in general, can we even hypothetically consider the possibility of the Ukrainian defense forces withdrawing from certain positions in the east of our country, given that there are defensive lines prepared there, both in terms of fortifications and, let's say, the kinds of structures and landscape solutions that, one way or another, are supposed to hold back the enemy, right? So how do you see this situation?
Well, actually, the communications that are ongoing at the geopolitical level, obviously, are not yet about a full-fledged peace process, or even a ceasefire for that matter. As for the actions of the armed forces of Ukraine, the defense forces, all their actions are adjusted from a security standpoint. That is, first and foremost, we're talking about the safety of our units, which must suffer minimal losses. Preserving the lives of our soldiers is the most important thing. And accordingly, if there are indeed more fortified positions, and as you can see, the enemy is actively using aviation, actively trying to impact our fortifications, in other words, they are fully destroying them. Therefore, such tactical withdrawals will continue. But once again, it's obvious that any withdrawal of our troops from a particular section of the front line will not be unplanned. There definitely won't be any unplanned withdrawals. Once again, I want to emphasize that everything will be done from the standpoint of ensuring the safety of the military operation. Let me remind you that Ukraine is currently conducting a strategic defensive operation. Unfortunately, at the moment, the initiative on the battlefield is on the offensive side of the Russians. However, let's also take a look at the map of hostilities today and the counteroffensive actions being carried out by the defense forces. In particular, even in the hottest spots like Mirnograd and Pokrovsk, you can see that these actions are yielding results, and the enemy has not managed to break through to the positions they have, let's say, even publicly claimed to have reached. A large number of infantry, the enemy's heavy use of aviation in these battles, and artillery, of course, are creating extremely difficult and brutal combat conditions for us. However, once again, the breakthroughs that the Russians are hoping for, at least as of this moment, have not happened today, and I hope they won't happen at all. Once again, if any withdrawals are planned or carried out, it will be for safety reasons, and of course by decision of the High Command. Obviously, all scenarios are being considered. If 0 hour comes, as they say bluntly, the envelope is opened, and they look at which combat order to carry out next. That's why everything is adjusted on the spot.
And this offensive initiative on the front clearly shows that Russia is not actually interested in any kind of peace, right? And here, I guess it's also worth mentioning that certain actions are taking place not only in Ukraine right now, right? Ukraine's defense forces are also striking deep inside the Russian Federation. In particular, a strike was carried out on a plant in the Tuvash Republic of the Russian Federation. This plant manufactures navigation equipment. Explosions and a fire were reported on the premises of the facility. The consequences of the strike are still being clarified. This was reported by the General Staff. At this plant in particular, they produce antennas for satellite systems, as well as Kometa modules that are resistant to electronic warfare. The enemy installs them on Kalibr, K-69, and Iskander missiles, as well as on drones like Shahed, Orlan-10, and Forepost. Moreover, with the help of this Kometa, the enemy turns ordinary aerial bombs into high-precision guided munitions. It's also worth noting that the plant is located 1,000 kilometers from Ukraine's state border, but in fact, it manufactures equipment for those types of weapons that the Russian Federation uses to attack Ukraine, including civilian infrastructure. If you look at it from this perspective, Ukraine is not only striking at the military potential and resources of the Russian Federation, but as I understand it, well, no matter how you look at it, we can't really separate this from politics. To what extent do these strikes deep into Russian territory, up to 1,000 kilometers, against legitimate military targets, let's say, affect our position?
Well, actually, last night, reconnaissance is still ongoing there. A strike was carried out, as far as we know, on the Novokuybyshevsk oil refinery. If we're talking about the military potential, the military-industrial complex of the Russian Federation, then let's at least look at a missile like the K-101, which the enemy hasn't used for quite some time. However, during one of the recent drone and missile attacks, the remnants of this missile showed that, for example, the K-101 is already being produced, or was produced. The ones used in the strike were made in the fourth quarter of this year. This means that the Russian defense industry is not coping with these challenges. And that's despite the fact that the Russians have an enormous number of air-launched missiles, which they've used throughout the full-scale aggression against Ukraine and continue to use. However, we see that today, as they say, they're taking these missile pies straight out of the oven and immediately launching attacks on Ukraine. This shows that the potential of the Russian defense industry has been significantly reduced. Accordingly, we're talking about more than just oil refineries. We're seeing unique facilities, in particular the plant in Chivashia, which is critical for an entire sector, not only aviation, but also the missile industry of the Russian Federation. That's why such strikes are, first of all, carried out exclusively with Ukrainian weaponry. We're talking about our jet-powered drones. We're talking about our drones that today can easily fly through the air defense systems of the Russian Federation and strike targets 1,000 kilometers or more deep inside Russian territory. That's a plus. So in this case, we're not limited in carrying out these tasks. No one can tell us that we don't have the right to use this weaponry. And in addition, you can see that these strikes have become much more accurate. Such strikes are happening systematically. Basically, this is happening every night. And accordingly, as I already mentioned, these are strikes on critically important facilities of the Russian military-industrial complex.
Sergei, tell me, lately, especially considering those so-called contacts and negotiations, there's this idea going around that Ukraine really needs to use this moment to make some kind of agreements or concessions with the Russian Federation. Well, first of all, I would note that we don't really see the Russian Federation there yet, since at various official levels they say, what plan? Well, we don't know, we haven't seen it. But, as always, they try to use this kind of position, saying things like, well, that's nonsense. How can we even take this seriously? Although, obviously, it's clear where the roots of this so-called peace proposal come from, accordingly. But still, when According to media reports, the American side says that it's difficult, obviously it's difficult, but they paint, to put it mildly, not very optimistic scenarios, noting that one way or another, Russia will keep advancing, and so on and so on.
Well, that's clear, right? But how do you actually look at this news, which you sometimes read and perhaps catch yourself thinking, why do our American partners paint things in such dark colors? Well, basically, we live with the realities that are unfolding on the battlefield today, and with carrying out the tasks assigned to the units, to the structural divisions of Ukraine's defense forces in all directions. We perceive from the fact that, unfortunately, the war is still ongoing today. It won't end tomorrow or the day after. We all understand this perfectly well. Accordingly, today we're mostly talking about what the Ukrainian defense forces can do to at least bring closer those peaceful communications that should and will correspond to the realities that are taking shape, including on the battlefield. Today, the Russians don't have the kind of advantage that would allow them to, let's say, dictate their terms or truly threaten the whole world. And everyone understands perfectly well that as soon as we mention our towns, in particular Kupiansk, I see footage of Gerasimov and Putin. So how many times have the Russians supposedly already taken Kupyansk, occupied Pokrovsk, Mirnograd? That is, even if you compare the maps from 2023 and 2025, you can see how far the Russians have managed to advance in these 2 years. And that's despite the fact that this military-industrial machine is working for killing, working for aggression, and operating at full capacity with an infantry component that outnumbers ours several times over. So everyone clearly understands that Ukraine is not just managing to hold back the enemy. Ukraine is managing to do what we mentioned a few minutes ago, deliver significant blows to the Russian economy. I'm not going to say that the Russian economy will collapse immediately after our broadcast, but it is, by leaps and bounds, heading exactly in that direction. In situations like this, you always remember the classic advice. First of all, information hygiene when you see this flood of news. And second, we need to do the most important thing, to hold out one day longer than the Russian Federation.
Sergei, we don't have much time left, but still, as of now, can we say that the Russian Federation is already approaching the point where its resources are running out? But still, they have enormous mobilization potential, and unfortunately, they still have significant economic capabilities as well. That includes support from other countries too. So what can we say about this as of today? Just briefly, please.
We're already talking about missiles, for example, the KH-101. Let's take a look, so to speak, at the history of this missile and how many foreign components are involved in its production. That's just one example. There are 116 Western European and American parts and components in it. But once the sanctions start working and the enforcement of those sanctions is appropriate, we'll see the Russian economy decline even faster. That's absolutely certain.
Subscribe to The Gaze and stay updated on the most important events, top news from Ukraine and all over the world, in-depth analysis, exclusive reports and interviews, all on hand in our channel. Join our community of viewers and stay tuned.